here we are. I am Sam. I work for Tearfund Australia, and I'm sitting today with our guest contributor to our Lent series, Mitch Everingham. He is a pastor at Anchor Church in Sydney, part of the team there, and also has authored a book on prayer, which he released about 18 months ago. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that. But thanks for being here with us today, Mitch.
Hey, pleasure. Yeah, great to be here and keen to be talking about Lent.
You got the outfit memo as well?
I did, but I walked into the foyer.
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Tell us about the book and tell us about who you are outside of this moment right here.
Yeah. So my name's Mitch. I've been a pastor for about 10 years now, serving at Anchor Church here in Sydney, like you mentioned. I put out a book about 18 months ago called Finding Peace Through Prayer. The subtitle for it is 7 Practices for Praying in Hard Times. So really the hope is that it gives people some practical tools for how to pray when life's hard, whether that's moments of suffering for people individually or for people around them, or just as they look around the world and see injustice and struggles that other people are going through and going, how do I pray? So that was the heart behind writing the book. There's some things that had happened in my life when I was younger, and I just went, I don't know how to pray. And so as I've kind of learned and grown from those experiences, I went, you know what, I wish I had a resource in some of those moments that taught me some of the things that I've had to learn the hard way. And so that's where the book came from, and that's where part of this reflection came from as well for the Lent series.
That's amazing. And tell us a little bit more about you. What do you like getting up to other than praying or writing books?
So outside of that, I mean, hanging out with my wife, Suze. We've got a young son, Jamie. He's 2 years old. So spending time with them. I grew up by the beach on the northern beaches of Sydney. So being at the beach is just like, that's my happy place. That's where I feel like my soul comes alive a bit. So going to the beach, drinking good coffee, eating good food, and football, like soccer football is
nice.
Moment
of truth that will dictate whether this interview goes any longer. But who's your team?
Liverpool.
Oh no, I'm a Manchester United. Tragic.
I
think we're done.
That's it.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. Thanks for giving us a little insight. And also the fact that you are so passionate and you've put so much time into the topic of prayer and have written this book that's come from so much of your personal story really does make you a great contributor to this Lent series, which for Tearfund is a huge moment annually, where all of our community, the Tearfund community and churches, community groups around Australia really rally around this season. It's not a Tearfund thing, it's a Christian thing, something that is really integral to our faith, is to approach Easter with this sense of reverence and deep contemplation. And so I wonder if you could speak to that for a moment, just in terms of Lent. How do you understand? What's the importance of it for you, and how are you approaching it?
So I mean, I think for me, like that 40-day stretch in the lead up to Easter has been pretty formative for probably about the last 7-8 years. I think growing up, I would have heard what Lent was. My grandparents didn't eat fish. That was about it. They only ate fish, not red meat. And just things like that where I was like, I don't really understand what this is. And then when I started to engage with it, particularly some of those key practices around fasting and prayer and giving, I think for me, it's helped me understand the enormity of what Jesus has done for me and what really is the centerpiece of our faith in a way that, I just probably had taken for granted in some ways growing up. And so having that extended period of time to contemplate what it cost Jesus on the cross and the sacrifice that he's made on my behalf, not just kind of over that Easter weekend, but in that prolonged way to really sit with that and allow that to do something inside of me in a way that you can't do in kind of rushed moments. Something that I'm really grateful for. And so I think generally in our society, we're not particularly good at sitting with things for a long period of time. Our news cycles churn over really quickly. We don't like waiting in general, and so sitting with something for that long, just that has a profound effect on us. It shapes us and forms us, and so every year I look forward to Lent.
It's amazing. Yeah, I love that Lent is an invitation to slow down and really consider what's valuable or important to us as believers, as those that are following after Jesus. And it's another opportunity this year to, again, just sit and contemplate the wonder and the wisdom of his example and what that means for me this year.
Yeah.
A big part of your devotion that you put together was focused on 1 Corinthians 13, which speaks to some of the practices that you're describing as well. And I wonder if you could speak to us for a moment just about, where is that intersection of those practices helping us slow down and find that God rhythm, find that slower kind of rhythm that aligns with, the invitation that Jesus extends to us through Lent. What ways does 1 Corinthians 13 instruct us and help us find that pace?
So I think 1 Corinthians 13 obviously being about love and the centrality of love. I think when we come to Easter, that's the pinnacle of love. For us as followers of Jesus, we look at the example of Christ on the cross and go, man, this is what love is. And so when we take the time to slow down, I think through some of the key practices at Lent, like fasting and prayer and giving, it's an opportunity for us ultimately not to partake in practices for the sake of doing these practices, but for the sake of forming us more into people who are like Christ and who become love as well. And so for me, when I think about the last couple of years for me with Lent, it's been, rather than fasting food, it's actually been fasting social media and any kind of other media that I would otherwise consume. It's things like Netflix, Instagram, Facebook, whatever it might be. Take all those things out for 40 days and go, how can I repurpose these things? So rather than just resisting that by fasting, go, okay, if I resist that, what do I embrace in its place that's going to form me into someone that hungers after God, that is trying to embody love like he showed us in Christ? And so the biggest two ways historically throughout church history that we see that are prayer and giving. And so that comes from Matthew 6, where Jesus has his teaching on giving to the needy, prayer and fasting. And these three practices kind of sit together, almost as Jesus' call after so much of his teaching throughout the Sermon on the Mount. It's this is how you go and do a lot of this. And so for me, that's meant pushing into a deeper life of prayer throughout those 40 days. So repurposing, retooling that time that I'd otherwise spend on my morning commute or before I go to bed or after my son's gone down for the night, and taking that time and going, I'm going to offer this in love to God, as an act of devotion to him, by praying. I'm going to take the resources that he's given me, and I'm going to think about how I can give them sacrificially to others at this time of year in just a more intentional way than I might at other points throughout the year. And so I found that to be really interesting, probably especially the last 2-3 years throughout that season, just the kind of opportunities that God gives when you take the time to slow down, that are probably there, they probably exist throughout the rest of the year, but when you're not paying attention to them and being intentional in thinking about them, you often just miss them. And so stopping and ponder for long enough to pray, and then be aware of the ways that I can give of myself and give of what God's given to me to other people. I think for me, they're kind of the key ways, the key practices that have formed me into someone that hopefully is loving others more as a response to the love that God showed me.
Yeah, wonderful, man. That's a great response and great way of framing that invitation that we see through 1 Corinthians 13. I also wanted to dig a little bit deeper into some of your comments about I guess this sense of at times feeling overwhelmed by the world that we live in and the injustices that are happening around the world. And that's a huge part of the Tearfund space and mission is working with partners abroad that are in really challenging, really difficult situations, polycrisis, and not one issue but many issues all at once. And so that's something that many of our supporters are, they live with, this sense of like, I want to do so much, and yet the problems at times can appear like they're compounding and getting worse and worse. And yet your revelation in all of this has been that actually through prayer we can give so much, and you just kind of spoke to that. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how prayer allows us to give so much to those parts of the world, or it is our way to participate in bringing about change.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think in a lot of situations we feel like there's this choice between either taking action or inaction. And so we look at all of the things happening around the world that we long for God to make right. We go, well, either do something, and if I don't have the capacity to do something, then my only choice is to not do anything. And I think it's this kind of false dichotomy that we can set up at times. Whereas when I read the scriptures, particularly I'm thinking of in 1 Peter, the Apostle Peter says, we cast all our anxieties, or literally it's like throw all of your worries onto God because he cares for you. And so there's this sense there that like God is a God that is big enough to catch all of our concerns, all of our worries, all of our anxieties, and not just for us, but for all people, for all of humanity across the whole world. And the way that happens is when we come to him in prayer. And so as I've thought about that and pondered that the last few years, I've just realized that if God is love, when we read 1 John, God is love. And if he's a God of love who cares for us, who can catch all of our concerns, then perhaps that dichotomy or false dichotomy of action or inaction, perhaps there's actually a third way that's in the middle, and I think that's prayer. I think the thing that ultimately we can do that is the biggest act of love for people sometimes is to pray for them. Because if God can catch all of their concerns, if he's big enough to hold all of their worries, and if he is a God who loves them more than we could ever love them, then I really believe that the biggest thing we can do is to pray, and that's actually the starting point for love. And so that's not to say that we don't take action, but I think it is to say that actually reframes often the moments where we feel so overwhelmed that we either feel paralyzed or we just don't do anything because it's like we're finite, we can only do so much, and they're realities we've got to sit with. But the thing that we can do, it's prayer. And prayer really is an act of giving. It's an act of giving ourselves, giving of our time, our attention, but ultimately it's giving the love that we have to offer to the one who loves them most, who looks over and watches over every single circumstance, and we ask for him to intervene. And so for me that's just been a really helpful way of reframing that kind of action or inaction paradigm that we feel, and realizing that I can offer myself in love by getting on my knees and praying. And I think particularly at Lent there's an invitation for us to press into that even more. To look around what we might see in the world and go, we want this to be made right, and we don't know what to do. God does, and he loves and cares for people more than we ever can. So the way you describe it just reminds me of just the trust that is inherent to praying like that it is, as you said in the devotional, it's the reminder of my insufficiency, but God's all sufficient. I'm trusting God in those moments that I come to him with confusion, emotions, doubt, fear, and surrendering it and trusting God's character, God's nature in those moments. And so it's a huge moment or expression of our trust for God, that he's in control. As we're talking about prayer, what's so central to everything that you're saying, and what we believe is Jesus' example, and that ultimately we are following in Jesus' footsteps and learning from Jesus, and
I thank God that we have Jesus, the earthly example, that he came to earth and took on human form and lived amongst us, and it showed us ways to navigate the complexity of life and being human. And where in the life of Jesus, I'm curious, where in the life of Jesus do you see this love present, or this love kind of flowing out of him in terms of ministry, but also his prayer life? Are there moments that you think of? The Garden of Gethsemane, obviously, that moment where there's this ultimate surrender of like, not my will but yours, God. Are there points or references in Jesus' life that you see this kind of loving prayer overflowing and exemplified?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a few places that my mind goes. One of them is like he teaches us, again, like Sermon on the Mount, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And like, I think I remember hearing that growing up and being like, that just doesn't really feel possible. Like, how do you love people who genuinely feel like your enemies or who are persecuting you? And I think the further I've gone in my life and the more that I've walked with Jesus, I've realized that there is a profound truth in that when they're held together as well. Like as you pray for people, it's pretty hard to pray for someone and not feel a greater sense of love for them. Like I don't know if I've ever prayed for someone and walked away being like, oh, I love that person less now. Like it generally is always just cultivating love in us. And so then if you kind of fast forward to the end of Jesus' life, like you mentioned, when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, just picture that moment. He's about to be betrayed by Judas. He's about to have his disciples abandon him. He's about to be crucified. And he's done nothing. And if I put myself in that situation, I'm like, how do I get out of this? Maybe want to fight back. And he's like, as you just mentioned, like, not my will, Lord. Like he asked, please, can this cup pass from me? Yet not my will, but yours be done.
Yeah.
And so there's this willingness to endure hardship as he prays for the sake of other people. And so that to me is like, that's the ultimate example of what Jesus has done in the Sermon on the Mount, what he's taught about in the Sermon on the Mount. He puts his money where his mouth is and says, okay, like I'm willing to endure hardship for others. And then on the cross, so Luke 23 says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. And that's the people who've just nailed him to the cross, who are taunting him. And that, I mean, man, forgiving people who are killing you in the moment, that's the greatest act of love imaginable. And so, yeah, I think we see that not just in what Jesus teaches, but also in what he models. Particularly as we think at Lent about Jesus' journey to the cross, like that only kind of ramps up towards the end. It doesn't wane off as he gets closer to the end, but it actually picks up, and even right until almost his final words, he's offering prayers to his Father in love for the very people that are killing him. And so, to me, that is the example of what a life of prayer looks like. Being willing to pray even for those people who ordinarily in our flesh we might just go, no, I'm not praying for them. Going, no, I'm actually going to step in. And how much more so than for people who we do love, or who we do look on out and go, they are worthy of our prayers. And so, the example of Jesus and the way that he teaches us to pray and then models that is so profound. I think especially at Lent, like this is a moment for us to push in. That's kind of the invitation to us, is to lean into a life of prayer. Whoever that might be for whatever God puts on our hearts, there's nothing that is beyond being worthy of prayer.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks for taking the time to give expression to that. I think that's so helpful, given the world that we live in, and more and more of the news feeds that we read are just full of trouble and difficulty and injustice, and to be reminded of Jesus Jesus' way of including everybody in terms of his prayers, and really being mindful of the victims and the oppressed, but then also the other side of that as well, and offering prayers for those that are making decisions or creating systems that are bringing harm, and also, considering the ways in which our prayer life can include all people, all things, and hopefully through our prayer life, and that's that surrender to God, seeing transformation of all things, is a really important example that Jesus offers. Is there anything else that when you think about your book and when you think about your own journey, in terms of prayer, is there anything else that you think is just really central or really key to understanding in terms of unlocking maybe another realm of prayer in our own life, or let's say you're speaking to somebody who really there's a lack of passion, or just not really motivated, have tried but haven't really seen anything surface. What would you say to them in terms of approaching prayer differently this Lent? How could they find that inspiration?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've probably got a couple thoughts. I think the first one is, I think the starting place is like remembering who we're praying to. So if you've been in church or been following Jesus for kind of any length of time, we always hit those moments where it just begins to feel a little bit stale, like a little bit mundane, and like we've been doing this for a long time, and that's, in a sense, like that's our human nature. That's natural, and so I think I'd want to say that's there's something that is okay about that, and recognizing that and owning that is helpful to name where you're at. But then I think the antidote to that is actually just coming back to the place that we started. So I remember when I was growing up, my parents would always say, like, in Jesus' name, Amen, when we'd finish any prayer. And so that was just kind of like a rote learned thing. And I don't reckon it was until probably like my early 20s that I stopped and thought about that.
Yeah.
I was like, when I pray, I'm praying to the same Jesus that walked this earth, that lived a sinless life, that was perfection embodied, who died a death in my place, death that I deserved, and then rose again from the dead, and now he's ruling and reigning at the right hand of the Father. And that's who I'm talking to. And then he promises me, like in John 14, that anything I ask in my name, in his name rather, not my name, will be done.
Yeah.
And so when we reframe it like that, and we actually stop and ponder that before we begin to pray, I think that for me, that repostures my heart, to go, this is not just a mundane, normal, rote act. This is reality defining.
Yeah.
I'm praying to the Lord of all things. I'm praying to the one who created the world that I walk upon, that I live on. And so I think for me, that's whenever my prayer life feels just a little bit lackluster, that's often the practice I have that I just come back to, is being like, before I start to pray, just taking a minute to kind of center myself and remind myself of who I'm praying to before I begin to pray. And I find that transforms not just the content of my prayers, but the posture of my heart as I begin to pray. And I begin to see prayer again as a moment of loving communion between me and Jesus, and not just something that I'm doing because I should do it, and not just something that I pray with a certain form because that's how I was taught to pray, but actually, that moment of loving communion again. And so I think that's the biggest encouragement I'd give to people, and the biggest thing I would say is to remember who you're praying to, and there's no better time of year to remember that than right now at Lent.
Yeah, such an important reminder. Are there any other or final comments that you want to make to the audience or the Tearfund community that on this process of Lent, and this year as they consider your devotion and the contribution that you've offered, and many other pieces and questions and passages of scripture that will cause them to think deeply about their faith and deeply about the world that we're living in. Is there any final remarks that you kind of want to say, or final words that you want to speak over them, or speak into their faith this year as they approach?
Yeah. I think I just encourage people to lean into this season. I think the church calendar can feel a bit foreign, or sort of like, what do we do with this? And just encourage people to lean in. This is something that throughout church history, Christians have observed this season for a reason, because it really does shape and change and transform who we are. When we take moments like this to kind of lean into what Jesus has done for us. And so whether that's picking up practices like fasting or prayer or giving, or all three, I think I just encourage people to press into this season, rather than it being something that is kind of just spoken about out there, or where you might read a resource or watch a video, or whatever it might be, to actually just take the time, even if it's kind of a few minutes each day, to stop and to pray and to reorient yourself afresh, if that's a practice that has kind of fallen by the wayside a bit, or to think about what you can fast from, to think about how you can give to others. And I really believe as we do those things, they're not just practices that we do because we're told to do them, but they're actually an invitation from Jesus into the life that he lived and the life that he longs for us to live. So I'd say press in.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Mitch, for your time today, and so lovely to have your support for this series, and all the best this Easter. Wishing you well.
Hey, pleasure.